California is often imagined as a place of sunlight, crowded highways, beaches, and endless movement. But far away from the noise of the major cities, there were towns where people knew their neighbors, children walked home from school, and a telephone ringing after dark was usually nothing more than an ordinary interruption. Then people began disappearing. What made these disappearances so terrifying was not simply that women and girls vanished without explanation. It was what happened afterward. Families received anonymous letters. Phones rang with strange voices. Relatives were warned not to contact the police. And, in several cases, the person on the other end of the line seemed to know details that only the killer could have known. The murders were eventually associated with an unidentified offender who became known as the Wednesday Strangler. The case began in April 1980 when the family of 19-year-old Sarah Miller reported her missing in the coastal town of Mendocino. Sarah had last been seen at home on April 12th. She had a history of previous suicide attempts, so at first, her relatives feared she might have harmed herself. Then, on April 16th, an anonymous letter arrived. The message claimed that Sarah would never be seen alive again, and seemed deliberately written to cause the family as much pain as possible. Before they could understand what was happening, the telephone calls began. A young-sounding man repeatedly contacted the family and warned them not to speak to police or the media. The calls were not frantic. They were controlled, deliberate, and deeply personal. Police began an extensive search of Mendocino and the surrounding area. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. No reliable sighting of Sarah could be confirmed. Then, on June 24th, workers at a local elementary school noticed something strange near the swimming pool. A heavy manhole cover appeared to have been disturbed. When investigators opened it, they found Sarah's badly decomposed body floating face up in shallow water below the school grounds. The discovery was horrifying enough, but it was only the beginning. While questioning school employees, detectives learned that workers had previously noticed similar signs of tampering near a septic tank elsewhere on the property. 3 days after Sarah's body was recovered, investigators drained and opened that tank. Beneath the surface were human remains. This victim had been dead for years. The remains were identified as those of 12-year-old Emily Thompson, a former student who had disappeared in 1975. Emily's disappearance had been mysterious from the beginning. Her mother operated a local business and sometimes had to leave her daughter alone while she worked. On August 27, 1975, Emily invited a friend to the apartment to study. The friend eventually left, leaving Emily alone. When her mother returned, the apartment was unsecured. The television was still playing. Emily's shoes were lying on the floor. But Emily was gone. There was no obvious struggle and no clear indication of where she had gone. Police searched the surrounding area and questioned neighbors, but nothing led them to her. For 5 years, Emily remained a missing child. Now detectives were looking at her case through a completely different lens. The bodies of Sarah and Emily were examined, but decomposition had destroyed much of the evidence that might have revealed exactly how they died. Investigators believed both may have been strangled. Both victims had been found without clothing, raising the possibility of a sexual motive. Most importantly, both had apparently disappeared from places where they should have been relatively safe. Detectives now believed they were dealing with a serial offender, and the killer was not finished. On October 7, 1981, 27-year-old Jessica Parker disappeared after finishing her shift at a local factory. She spoke briefly with co-workers before walking toward home. She never arrived. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a vacant car park about 24 miles northeast of Mendocino. This time, there was enough evidence to establish the cause of death. Jessica had been strangled, apparently with a length of power cord. The marks around her neck suggested that the killer had used considerable force. Then came another disappearance. On February 17th, 1982, 11-year-old Katie Williams vanished while walking home from school. The area where she was believed to have been abducted was close to the same vacant car park where Jessica's body had been found. The next morning, Katie was discovered dead. She had been strangled, her clothing had been removed, and her body had been concealed in an orchard near a junior school. But the most disturbing developments were still to come. On the same day Katie's body was discovered, police received a postcard suggesting that the child had initially been taken during a ransom attempt and killed after resisting. Then another student received a bizarre telephone call. The caller attempted to impersonate Katie. The voice was pretending to be a dead girl. For detectives, the similarity to the calls made after Sarah Miller's disappearance was impossible to ignore. When investigators reviewed the cases side by side, they noticed another unsettling pattern. 3 of the 4 victims had disappeared on the same day of the week. Wednesday. That coincidence was enough for the press and investigators to begin using a name that would follow the case for decades: the Wednesday Strangler. After Katie's murder, the killings appeared to stop. For years, there was silence. No new body, no confirmed sighting, no arrest. But the silence did not mean the nightmare was over. On January 25, 1987, 37-year-old Theresa Young was having dinner with her family when the telephone rang. Theresa answered. Her relatives noticed that the conversation quickly seemed to frustrate her. Eventually, she hung up and told her family she needed to go out because a friend urgently needed a ride. She also told her son that she was meeting someone for dinner. Those stories would later become important. Theresa never returned. Her car was found abandoned at a bowling alley, but she was nowhere to be seen. Then investigators discovered another disturbing connection. Theresa had worked at the same factory where Jessica Parker had once been employed. 2 days later, a couple driving through a nearby forest stopped at an isolated shrine on an escarpment. As they looked down the slope, they saw what appeared to be a human body. Police arrived and descended the steep rock face. What they found was far worse than a single body. There were 3. The first was Theresa Young. She had been stripped and strangled, apparently with rope or heavy electrical cable. Nearby was the badly decomposed body of 50-year-old Diane Carter. Diane had disappeared after telling her husband she was going to a local shop. A passerby later reported seeing her standing beside the road, apparently talking to someone. Then the phone calls began. An unidentified young-sounding man contacted Diane's family and claimed she had already been killed. He said her body had been hidden somewhere in a nearby mountain pass. Police searched the location. Nothing was found. At first, they suspected a cruel prank. Then silent calls began arriving at the family home and Diane's workplace. And at the shrine, investigators found a third body. It belonged to 48-year-old Susan Foster, another local woman who had disappeared after leaving work. The surrounding forest was searched thoroughly. Personal belongings belonging to the 3 victims were found scattered throughout the area. It looked as though someone had deliberately used the forest as a dumping ground. 7 victims were now associated with the case, and after years of fear, investigators finally announced that they had a suspect. His name was Michael Ross. Ross was 26 and already serving a prison sentence in another state for unrelated crimes. Police believed he had been involved in an affair with Theresa Young and may have been the man who called her home before her disappearance. He had also been a regular customer at the restaurant where Susan Foster worked and lived relatively close to the Carter family. Investigators described him as a man with a violent temper who frequently abused alcohol or drugs. Then came what appeared to be the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Police produced a written confession. According to investigators, Ross had voluntarily admitted responsibility for the final 3 murders. But the moment Ross appeared in court, the story changed. He denied being the killer. He claimed detectives had fabricated the confession and physically forced him to sign it. The judge halted the prosecution, and for nearly a decade, the case seemed to disappear into legal uncertainty. Ross eventually completed his sentence and was released. Later, he returned to prison after another burglary. Then, in 2002, investigators came back to him. This time, they had what they described as newly analyzed DNA evidence from the seats of Theresa Young's car. Ross was formally charged with the murders of Theresa, Diane, and Susan. For the victims' families, it seemed that after more than 20 years, justice might finally be possible. But the trial in 2005 ended in another devastating reversal. The judge was highly critical of the investigation and questioned how the case had been assembled. Ross again said his confession had been forced. He also admitted that he had previously been inside Theresa Young's vehicle. That admission weakened the importance of the DNA evidence because it offered an innocent explanation for his presence inside the car. Ross was acquitted. He was awarded compensation, and he walked out of court a free man. The only serious suspect investigators had ever publicly identified had escaped conviction. But the unanswered questions did not disappear. During the investigation, witnesses had reported seeing an unidentified man driving a white Toyota around the area during the period of the first 4 killings. Several people claimed they had seen the man stopping near schoolgirls and speaking to them as they walked to or from school. One witness even provided part of the vehicle's registration number. It was never enough to identify the driver. There was also a theory that Emily Thompson may have known her killer. That possibility was based on the strange circumstances of her disappearance. There had been no obvious struggle inside the apartment, and investigators wondered whether Emily had opened the door to someone she trusted. One witness reportedly gave police the name of a possible suspect, but refused to provide a formal statement, because doing so could have exposed her own affair to her husband. It was another lead that disappeared into the growing maze of unanswered questions. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the way the killer seemed to turn ordinary places into places of danger. A family home, a school, a road used by children, a factory where people finished their shifts and walked home, a bowling alley car park, a forest shrine. None of these locations should have felt connected. Yet, as the investigation developed, they became pieces of the same nightmare. The school grounds are perhaps the most chilling example. When Sarah Miller's remains were discovered beneath the swimming pool area, investigators were already looking at a murder. But finding Emily Thompson's remains inside a septic tank transformed the meaning of the entire location. Emily had been missing for 5 years. Someone had apparently known where to hide her. Someone had returned to the area, and someone had gone to the trouble of concealing her beneath rocks and stones. That suggests planning rather than a spontaneous act. The same disturbing sense of planning appears again and again throughout the case. Bodies were not simply left where the killer happened to abandon them. They were hidden, moved, or placed in locations where they might remain undiscovered for long periods. And then there was the communication. Most murderers, if they are trying to avoid capture, have one obvious objective: remain silent. The alleged Wednesday Strangler seemed to do the opposite. After Sarah disappeared, the killer contacted her family. After Diane disappeared, another caller claimed to know she was dead, and even gave investigators a location where her body was supposedly hidden. After Katie's murder, someone attempted to imitate the dead girl over the telephone. These incidents created something beyond grief. They created uncertainty. A family member could no longer hear a telephone ring without wondering whether the killer was calling again. A police officer could not automatically assume an anonymous caller was lying, and every strange voice had to be considered against the possibility that the person calling knew something investigators did not. That psychological element may have been just as important to the killer as the murders themselves. If the purpose was simply to eliminate victims, there would have been little reason to contact their families. But if the purpose included control, intimidation, or watching the emotional consequences from a distance, the calls make far more sense. This is also why the case remains difficult to interpret. There are facts, there are theories, and there are gaps between them. Investigators could establish that people disappeared. They could recover bodies. They could identify similarities in the killings, but they could not reliably reconstruct every moment between the victims' last known movements and the discovery of their remains. The passing years made that problem worse. Witness memories fade, buildings change, vehicles disappear, records are lost, physical evidence deteriorates, and people who once knew something important may eventually die without ever explaining what they saw. The unknown man in the white Toyota is a perfect example. Even if the sightings were accurate, the information available to investigators was limited. A partial registration number might seem valuable, but without enough additional evidence, it could lead nowhere. A person could remember a vehicle, but misremember its color. A witness could remember a face, but confuse it with someone else. A frightened schoolgirl might remember only that a stranger stopped nearby. Every fragment might have been important, yet no single fragment was enough to solve the case. And then there is the possibility that the investigation itself may have been influenced by the growing legend of the Wednesday Strangler. Once the killer's name became known, every disappearance could be viewed through the shadow of that name. Every strange telephone call seemed more threatening. Every abandoned vehicle could become suspicious. Every Wednesday could feel like a warning. The more investigators searched for a single pattern, the harder it became to separate genuine clues from coincidence. And that uncertainty would follow the case for decades. Perhaps the most disturbing mystery is why the killings stopped. If one person was responsible for all 7 murders, why did the attacks suddenly end? Maybe the killer was imprisoned for another crime. Maybe he died. Maybe he became frightened after police began closing in. Or perhaps the murders were never the work of a single person. Some investigators and researchers have pointed to major differences between the early victims and the final 3. The first group consisted primarily of children and younger women. The later victims were middle-aged women with families. That difference raises the possibility of multiple offenders, with later killers copying details from earlier crimes. But there is another detail that makes the single killer theory difficult to dismiss. The telephone calls, the letters, the impersonation of a dead victim, the deliberate attempts to frighten grieving families. Those behaviors were unusual enough to suggest that whoever was responsible wanted more than simply to kill. He wanted people to know he was there. He wanted families to feel watched. And most terrifyingly, he appeared to enjoy knowing that they could do nothing to stop him. The Wednesday pattern may have been coincidence. The strangulations may have been copied. Some of the similarities may have been exaggerated over time. But 7 women and girls disappeared, and their deaths were linked by enough disturbing similarities to create one of California's darkest unsolved mysteries. Even the identity of the person who called the families remains uncertain. The man who knew where the bodies were, the man who knew which families to frighten, the man who may have watched children walking home from school, and the man who, despite decades of investigation, was never conclusively identified. Modern technology can preserve evidence that investigators in the 1970s and 1980s could barely imagine. DNA testing, surveillance cameras, digital records, and advanced forensic analysis have transformed criminal investigations. Yet technology cannot recover evidence that was never collected. It cannot recreate a conversation nobody recorded. It cannot tell detectives what a frightened victim was thinking in the final moments of her life. and it cannot force a killer who has remained silent for decades to finally speak. The Wednesday Strangler case remains a reminder of how terrifying an unknown predator can be. Because the most frightening part is not knowing that a killer existed. It is knowing that somewhere, a person may have lived an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. Someone who went to work. Someone who drove through town. Someone who answered the telephone. Someone who could stand beside a stranger without anyone realizing what he might have done. The murder stopped. The call stopped. The investigation faded. But the question never received an answer. Who was the Wednesday Strangler? And if Michael Ross was not responsible for all of the killings, as the court ultimately determined, then who was? Perhaps the killer died without ever confessing. Perhaps he lived for decades, knowing that the families of his victims were still waiting for answers. Or perhaps the person responsible simply disappeared into ordinary life, leaving behind nothing but 7 victims, a trail of unanswered questions, and a name that still carries the weight of fear. The Wednesday Strangler was never conclusively identified, and that may be the most disturbing ending of all.